You're welcome to another edition of the Islamic Finance Weekly, where we bring you perspective and analysis on how the non-interest finance market can serve as a veritable tool for supporting economic growth and development. At a recent webinar on Islamic finance organized by TAIF Digital Institute, Mufti Ismail Desai, Shariah advisor with the institute, shared his perspective on doing business the Sharia-compliant way, guidance to ethical entrepreneurship. He began by stating that the purpose of the presentation was to cover several aspects and essential fundamentals on Islamic economics, banking, and finance.
Today's discourse would cover several aspects, and as per the promotional material that you have been exposed to, we would undertake to provide guidance around several topics and essential fundamentals on Islamic economics, banking, and finance. We move over to the first slide around Islamic finance and conventional finance.
Given the definition of Islamic banking, the scholar said Islamic banking constitutes Islamic laws. It is also governed by Sharia and asset-backed financing.
What is the definition of Islamic banking? It is essentially, banking in consonance with Islamic laws. It is governed by Sharia law, and a fundamental point is that money has no intrinsic utility. And perhaps one of the earliest scholars who have documented that money is not a store of value is Imam Ghazali rahimahullah, who has mentioned very clearly that money is just a medium of exchange. It has no intrinsic utility, and it is merely for facilitating transactions.
He further outlined the requirements of Islamic finance and Sharia-compliant transactions.
And this slide basically discusses, the requirements of Islamic finance. That is, it is asset-backed. There's a prohibition of interest, a prohibition of certain activities. There's a prohibition of uncertainty, like for example in life insurance, and there's profit and loss sharing, in certain transactions like mudaraba, etc.
Mufti Ibrahim also highlighted the fundamental tenet of Islamic finance. He believed Islamic bank is backed by real assets or services, and there is actual violation when it comes to Islamic banking.
Basically, this slide discusses, some of the fundamental tenets of Islamic finance, like the prohibition of interest, the prohibition of gharar, which is speculative behavior. And one of the major differences, as you can see towards the end of the slide, is that Islamic finance is backed by real assets or services. So in other words, that there is actual value creation when it comes to Islamic banking.
It gave insight into the operations of Islamic banks, from investment, treasury services to financing products based on mudaraba or wadiya.
This is a snapshot of an Islamic bank. As you can see that the deposits are either based on mudaraba or wadiya or trust, and then you have the shareholders that pool funds together, and those funds are then used for Islamic treasury services or money market accounts, Islamic investments, and Islamic financing products.
Speaking further, he noted that there are three broad categories in Islamic banking, such as equity-based transaction, trading-based transaction, and list-based transaction.
Essentially, there are four basic categories from a conventional perspective: that is equity-based, trading-based, lease-based, and debt-based. But from an Islamic perspective, there are only three bases or broad categories. That is an equity-based transaction, a trading-based transaction, and a lease-based transaction. We'll go through these concepts very quickly. So the first concept that we'd like to discuss is musharaka. So musharaka refers to an equity-based transaction where two or more parties pool their capital together, and the profits are shared based on an agreement, but loss is based on capital contribution ratio. So remember that the loss is based on capital contribution ratio, and you cannot fix the profit as a fixed number. Yes, you can fix the profit as a fixed percentage, and all mechanisms should be introduced before the initiation of the partnership. What we've seen before in the past is that unfortunately two brothers get together, or several brothers get together, they form a partnership, but there's no documentation. And then they come to us as scholars to dispute the issues, and we find that there's no documentation. So in other words, it then becomes an issue of he said, and she said. So remember that in today's times, it's extremely important for one to document one's agreements in a Sharia compliant manner, seek advice from the scholars.
Giving illustrations on each equity participation, He explained the first concept, which is musharaka.
This here is an example or a snapshot of how a musharaka is. So you have the partner A that contributes to a venture, partner B that also contributes to a venture. The profit is shared according to an agreed ratio, and the loss is based only on the capital ratio. So let's say if partner B contributes 50%, partner A contributes 50%. So the loss will be shared based on their contribution ratio only.
He also gave insight into mudaraba, which is based on partnership.
The next slide is what is called a mudaraba or musharaka, which is modern application in terms of how musharaka is applied in the modern sense. So musharaka is applied in the modern sense by having a diminishing musharaka facility, where the home finance is done on a diminishing musharaka, where the bank partners with the client, and then the client slowly buys out the bank shares. So this is also an example of a modern concept of diminishing musharaka. So you can see here that the client and bank purchases the asset together, right? And the bank essentially sells its shareholding to the client over a fixed term. Right? So this is an example of a diminishing musharaka.
He shared insight on some of the Islamic finance instruments and the value they create in the market, especially in Islamic finance hubs like Malaysia.
So this is a snapshot of how an ijara would work. Basically, you would find that the bank would purchase the asset and then lease it on to the client for a fixed tenure, and at the end of the term, either the client gives the asset to the client or sells it to the client for a balloon payment. This is what is called commonly as an ijara wa iqtina, or it is also called a diminishing ijara contract. Next slide. So in terms of an Islamic banking perspective, vehicle finance is generally done under the concept of ijara bil iqtina. There's also a diminishing ijara. Another important point is that the risk, as per point 8, the risk of loss sits with the lessor in the ijara, because the daman or the liability of the asset remains with the lessor, not with the lessee. And the ownership also sits with the lessor, because, as I said, that the risk stays with the lessor, not the lessee. Next slide. Another contemporary concept in Islamic banking and finance is salam, and in a contemporary example of this is the Dubai Islamic Bank sugar financing product, where the bank purchases sugar from a mill and then sells it on a parallel salam or salam contract to corporates. This is an example of salam. Initially, salam was impermissible, and the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum, may Allah be pleased with them, then requested Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to say, we plant our crops, but the buyers come early to buy them. We can't sell them because the produce is not ready, and we need the funds. So then, on that basis of need and necessity, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam then allowed an Islamic forward sale. And an Islamic forward sale, another example of this is in today's times we have what is called drop shipping or e-commerce, where a person registers for an online shop and he sells products which doesn't belong to him. This is an example of an Islamic forward sale. However, there are certain conditions, all in 7 conditions that must be fulfilled, and basically the products need to be specified, etc., in order for one to conduct a valid Islamic forward sale. Next slide. This is an example of a salam. As you can see, the Islamic bank purchases from the client or producer, which is the mill, and then sells on a parallel salam contract to the final buyer. Next slide. A very similar concept to salam is istisna. Istisna refers to a contract executed to produce an asset. So istisna could be used for off-plan sales of assets. For example, a developer wants to sell units, real estate, then they can use the istisna concept to sell off-plan units. Next example. So the next concept is Takaful. Takaful refers to Islamic mutual indemnification, and it is quite a rapidly growing industry. And in Malaysia, for example, the penetration rate is approximately 30%, and it is only growing.
The TAIF Institute advisor also addressed the issues around the Sukuk, or Islamic bond, as a vital debt instrument in the market.
Some of the main Shariah guidelines around Sukuk include ensuring that the prospectus is Shariah compliant, that the income received is delivered from direct assets, they can't be, the returns have to be specified, and the underlying activities have to be Sharia compliant, etc. Next slide. So this represents the differences between Sukuk and conventional instruments. As you can see with Sukuk refers to it represents an ownership at the underlying asset. Maturity of the Sukuk corresponds to the term, and the prospectus is Sharia compliant, etc. If you look at a conventional debt instrument, it's basically a debt obligation, and the underlying asset does not necessarily have to be Sharia compliant. The prospectus also not screened for Sharia compliance.
He concluded his presentation with the common pitfalls that relate to Muslim businesses, which include mediation and arbitration, partnership equity debt, employment at date of sweat, and documenting contracts. He said there is need to stay away from riba, which is also known as interest.
Some of the most common pitfalls that we have noticed include the following. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَالصُّلْحُ خَيْرٌ, that when there is a dispute, when there is an argument, to make sulah and to resolve one's issues internally through sulah is the best. Unfortunately, we find many parties, disputing parties, litigating parties, they spend millions and millions of dollars in the courts without any resolution. All of that money gets wasted, and it is a waste of time and effort and resources. And the best method for that is to have what is called a med-arb clause. So in other words, that there is mediation, arbitration between the parties. And in that, alhamdulillah, we as ulama and scholars involved in the field, we offer the service where if there is a dispute, both the parties, they agree to our terms and conditions, and we then free of charge resolve their dispute. The other issue is in terms of a partnership, that is, two parties intend to engage into a business deal. Say for example, one party is the entrepreneur, the other party has the funds. So the party with the funds does not have a deal, he does not have the requisite networks to arrange for such deals, but the entrepreneur has the networks, he has the parties to whom he can contract with, but he doesn't have the funds. So both of them pull the resources together to engage in a business deal. So how should it be done? So there are two ways of it being done. One is it could be done on an equity basis, like either musharaka or mudaraba, or it could be done on a murabaha basis. So where, for example, let's say one party purchases a vehicle and he knows that he can sell the vehicle for a good profit. So in other words, what will happen is the financier can then purchase the vehicle and then sell it to the partner for a fixed markup. So whether or not he makes a higher profit or not, it doesn't matter, but it becomes clarified. This, I feel, as a self-liquidating method of partnership where it is done on a murabaha basis, is one of the best methods, because then there is no disputes. The third point is in terms of employment. We find that many of our employers, unfortunately, the complaint is that they don't treat their workers well, they don't treat the employees well. Remember that there are very clear hadith warning employers that don't pay your employee before his sweat dries up. So imagine now that this is very clear and specific guidance from the hadith to promote the rights of employees. And lastly, I would say that what we've seen is that unfortunately many people get involved in business, but they don't have proper documentation. Addar radiallahu ta'ala, a sahabi of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, once bought a slave from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam told him that record the transaction, that la da'a wa la khimthata, that this slave does not have any defects. So Addar radiallahu ta'ala said that how is it possible that the Nabi of Allah would sell me a defective slave? So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam then said, no, record this transaction. That shows us the importance of ensuring that our dealings are all documented and recorded. Another important point, and as I've alluded to this, is Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu idha tadayantum bidayn. When you have a debt, then document the debt. So in that ayat of the Quran, the Mufassirin mentioned now that it is preferable to record one's financial dealings. In fact, in today, I say that it is wajib or fard for a person to document his financial dealings so that there is no disputes going forward.
And that will be all for this edition of the Islamic Finance Weekly. Join our website www.populace.com to watch our videos, read our news stories. You can also send your feedback and comments to reporter@populace.com. Till we come your way again, thank you for watching. Have a nice day, stay safe, and bye for now.